Hi everyone, Sonia T here. Before I start this video, I would like to pose a few questions for you to keep in your head as you watch. Question 1. This video is fully subtitled by the same human you hear speaking and or see on screen right now. I do this because accessibility is very important to me. Are there any additional accessibility features you would like me to add? Question 2. Is there anything I said in this video that felt new and interesting to you? Anything I said that you don't think you've heard anyone else say? Question 3. Is there anything I said in this video that you've felt before but never been able to express in words or never heard anyone else say? Question 4. Is there anything I said that you disagreed with? If you have answers to any of those questions, please put them in the comments. I'm still pretty new to this, so every little bit of engagement means the world to me. Even if you don't leave a comment, please like this video if you enjoyed it, dislike this video if you want to make me cry, and of course subscribe and hit that bell icon for notifications whenever I post a new video. Okay, now on to the real thing. Being that Ocarina of Time is a game driven by its story, I feel compelled at this point to give a summary of its story, just in case anyone in the audience needs a refresher. I'll try to keep this as quick as possible. Link is a boy who's been troubled by prophetic dreams involving a sinister-looking man on horseback. Link lives among the childlike Kokiri and Kokiri Forest. Unlike the others, he hasn't been granted a fairy companion, at least not until the beginning of the game. Link's new fairy, Navi, brings him to Kokiri Forest Guardian. The Great Deku Tree gives Link the spiritual stone of the forest, the Kokiri's emerald, and then tells Link to meet Princess Zelda at Hyrule Castle. Then the Great Deku Tree dies. Princess Zelda tells Link that she's been having prophetic dreams, the same kinds of prophetic dreams Link has been having about an evil threat to the land of Hyrule. She thinks the desert sorcerer Ganondorf is merely feigning loyalty to the king in an attempt to seize the wish-granting magic of the Triforce, which had been locked away in the Temple of Time. Zelda tells Link that the keys to entering the Temple of Time are the Ocarina of Time and the 3 spiritual stones. She sends Link on a quest to get the remaining 2 spiritual stones, the Goron's Ruby and the Zora Sapphire, in order to get the Triforce before Ganondorf dies. Link meets with the Gorons of Death Mountain and the Zora's River and completes their respective dungeons in order to gain the remaining 2 spiritual stones. Before Link can return to Zelda, he sees her fleeing Ganondorf. Zelda throws the Ocarina of Time without Ganondorf noticing, and Link manages to use it to enter the Temple of Time, where he finds the legendary Master Sword embedded in a stone pedestal. Link takes the sword out of the pedestal and is enveloped in light. He wakes to find that the power of the Master Sword has sealed him away for 7 years and that he's now an adult. After a conversation with the sage named Rauru and a mysterious ninja named Sheik, Link learns that by taking the Master Sword, he unsealed the Triforce and allowed Ganondorf to take it. Ganondorf has destroyed Hyrule Castle and built an ominous tower in its place. In order to stop Ganondorf from conquering the rest of the world, Link must gather the powers of 6 total sages. Rauru, the first one he meets, is the Sage of Light. Link must find the other 5 sages by completing 5 temples: the Forest Temple, the Fire Temple, the Water Temple, the Shadow Temple, and the Spirit Temple. These temples comprise the second set of dungeons. After Link finds all 6 sages, Sheik is revealed to be Zelda in disguise and is promptly kidnapped by Ganondorf. Link enters Ganondorf's tower, defeats Ganondorf, and rescues the princess. Zelda sends Link back in time to live out his lost childhood. Roll credits. Okay, cool. Glad that's over with. One of the primary strengths of Ocarina of Time, and one of the reasons why I think it's still worth examining all these years later, is how it tells its story, and all the compelling details you can uncover if you pick it apart. I don't mean to say that Ocarina of Time is a masterclass in subtext or anything like that, because the story it's telling is rather broad and simple. Nor do I mean to say that it's an immaculately crafted story, because there are plenty of annoying rough edges and loose ends that I would have liked to tidy be up if I had control of the game's final draft. No, I just mean to say that this game makes effective use of the tools of game design to tell its story. Up to this point, I've discussed the design of Ocarina of Time, starting with the earliest portions of the game and proceeding chronologically from there. Having now given some basic story context with that plot summary, I want to start breaking away from a restrictive chronological approach. So, from now on, I'm going to be jumping around a bit. I've already talked about how hunting for rupees in Kokiri Forest and sneaking past guards in Hyrule Castle are sequences that use game design to convey a story. That is, I've talked about how these sequences convey their own small, individual stories, but how do they fit into the broader story? Well, Kokiri Forest is Link's home, and so it's designed to be a comfortable place to be. But Ocarina of Time is a story about Link leaving his home. This is true in a literal sense, but the game makes it more emotionally tangible by putting Kokiri Forest out of the way, by making it just slightly inconvenient to go back. Whenever you return, it's always for some specific purpose. It never exactly becomes a home base. So, it's an expression of that classic storytelling trope. Link leaves home, and he can never really come back. He becomes a perpetual outsider. When he leaves the forest for the first time, he finds a world full of adults telling him where he isn't allowed to go. He's stopped by guards in Gerudo Valley, in Kakariko Village, and in Hyrule Castle. Link will eventually find ways to get past these guards. The Hyrule guards can be sneaked past. The guard in Kakariko Village will submit to a royal decree, and the Gerudo guards will show respect to an adult Link, provided he has showed them that, in addition to being handsome, he's also skilled in combat and subterfuge. In these cases, Link is rendered an outsider in a way that is literal, intentional, and obvious. People have consciously decided he's not allowed somewhere and will go as far as physically throwing him out or imprisoning him if he's caught trespassing. And while the Kingdom of Hyrule has to employ guards to throw out unwelcome guests, the Lost Woods is able to do so through some kind of forest magic, whisking you away back to Kokiri Forest at the slightest misstep. The framing is different, but the effect is similar. Link is made an outsider in these places because forces conspire to put him outside of them. In a less direct way, but just as impactful, there are places in the game that render Link an outsider through their environmental design. Princess Zelda sends Link off to the city of the Gorons in Death Mountain and the domain of the Zoras of Zora's River. And in both of these places, Link's status as an outsider is conveyed more subtly through the design of the environments. Goron City, the home of the rock-eating people known as Gorons, is a big hole carved into Death Mountain. Goron City has a friendly atmosphere, with its goofy musical theme and its smiling, pot-bellied residents. They've grown accustomed to the delicious rock sirloin of Dodongo's cavern, but with the cavern suddenly becoming infested with monsters, they've lost access to the only food source that their gourmet palate can tolerate. The Gorons face the threat of starvation, but still express themselves openly and honestly to Link. At worst, Darunia, the leader of the Gorons, has locked himself up in his room, out of crankiness more than anything else. And as long as you can play the right song for him, he cheers up instantly. When Link saves their food supply, Darunia proudly and cheerfully declares Link his sworn brother. But Link is still an outsider here. Gorons are big, heavy galoots who like to curl up into a ball and roll around, and if they collide with Link, he takes damage. What is, to them, a basic form of movement is, to Link, a hazard. Moreover, their home environment of Goron City is unwelcoming for a variety of reasons. For an obvious example, look no further than the pool of lava that they keep around. Gorons have a high tolerance for heat, so it probably just feels like a spa to them, even if it has a more damaging effect on Link. But the unwelcoming feeling of Goron City runs deeper than that. It is one of the most complex contiguous spaces in the game, certainly the most complex space that isn't inside a dungeon. It's comprised of 4 levels, 3 concentric rings stacked on top of a bottom floor. The different levels are connected to each other through winding tunnels. These tunnels don't read clearly on the 2-dimensional map, and because of how tunnels work when you're inside them, your view of the surrounding area is limited. It is quite different from Link's original home in the Kokiri Forest,
which spreads its points of interest across a wide, mostly flat, horizontal space, where any one point is visible from almost any other point. Goron City, by contrast, is arranged vertically, with its points of interest tucked in the recesses of its tunnels, and its anonymous brown walls offering little navigational assistance. Link can easily hop down from one level to the other, all the way to the bottom, but navigating back up is more involved, which isn't to say that it's particularly difficult, or takes a particularly long time. It's just to say that Goron City is a more difficult area to map out in your head.
It does have one thing in common with Kokiri Forest, however, as well as Castletown and Kakariko Village for that matter, and that is their roughly circular arrangement. So you could get the sense that the Kokiri, the Hylians, and the Gorons arrange their living spaces in broadly similar ways. Someone traveling from one place to another may have to make some adjustments and account for some cultural differences, but eventually they can become more familiar, more comfortable.
Zora's domain is arranged very differently. The semi-aquatic home of the fish-like Zora people is located in a cave behind a waterfall. It is atmospherically impressive, with its mellow theme music accompanied by the sounds of splashing water and the glittery reflections on the cave's ceiling. It has a simple layout. You enter on a cliffside path overlooking a pond. The path splits, one side leading down to the lower level and the pond, the other side leading up to King Zora's throne room. A stream runs through the throne room, flowing into a waterfall that flows back into the pond. And that's it, more or less. Zora's domain feels notably sparse compared to the other inhabited regions of Hyrule. Kokiri Forest, Castletown, and Kakariko Village have houses. Gerudo Fortress is hardly domestic, but it seems like a serviceable place to lay your head down at night. Even Goron City seems to suggest that the Gorons might live in tunnels just out of sight. There is nothing of the sort in Zora's domain. Sure, the shopkeeper has a bit of space to himself, and King Zora has his throne room, but where a typical Zora might live isn't clear. Maybe they all sleep in the pond, out in the open, a reflection of how different their customs are. Or maybe it's a way of implying that the Zora are politely refusing to let Link into their homes. Or maybe the developers just didn't have the time to give Zora's domain a lot of detail.
Regardless, altogether the impression is given that the Zoras have a reclusive, somewhat aloof culture. This aloofness is represented in more obvious ways as well. In Goron City, you have to prove your connection to the royal family to talk to the Goron's leader, Darunia, but you have to prove your connection to the royal family to even step foot inside Zora's domain. Darunia is forthright and stands on the same ground as Link, whereas King Zora can only be addressed by a subject who grovels at the platform beneath him.
Simple as its layout may be, getting around Zora's domain isn't a completely trivial task. The water is the key thing here. Navigating Zora's domain, including Zora's fountain up above it, is a test of the player's patience with Link's meager swimming abilities. These abilities can be boosted slightly by winning a silver scale from a simple diving game. The silver scale lets him dive deeper, deep enough to reach into a teleportation gate situated at the bottom of the Zora's domain pond. The gate teleports him to Lake Hylia, the other major aquatic region in Hyrule. And, just as in Zora's domain, swimming around it is a bit of a chore. The fish-like Zora people are naturally most at home in or near the water, but Link has a harder time with it. And it's not because the water is hostile to him, but because it's passively unaccommodating. What is actively hostile are the monsters found in Lake Hylia. Link is slow and defenseless when he's swimming, making him easy prey. Little feels worse than being hunted down by the giant four-legged bugs called Tektites that can skim across the surface of Lake Hylia. Except maybe getting rocks spat at you by the Octoroks that burst out from its depths. All told, it gives the impression that Link would much rather be on dry land.
The lands of the Gorons and the Zora are not the only areas in Ocarina of Time's world that are convoluted or inconvenient, of course. These are just examples of how the game uses environmental design to make Link feel like an outsider. In other words, they're using the language of game design and mechanics to tell a story.
So, based on what I've said so far, you could see Ocarina of Time as the story of someone who has to learn to empathize with different kinds of people, and value their different ways of living in order to help them. If Goron City and Zora's domain were flattened out and made easier to deal with, something would be lost. In one of those cases, you can see this directly. When Link becomes an adult, Ganondorf has frozen over Zora's domain and drains most of Lake Hylia. This makes it more convenient to get around both of those areas, but the convenience feels wrong, knowing that it comes at the cost of the Zora's home. Link is fighting to restore them back to being the pain in the ass that they used to be. And that is a nice, sweet story. But this interpretation has a more sinister flip side, and both of those interpretations were articulated by the writer Liz Ryerson in her article Evil Was Born. The world is designed for Link. Everything in Hyrule exists to appease and glorify him. Every bush is there for him to cut down. Every treasure is there for him to plunder. Every land is there for him to conquer. All the denizens of the world are there to hail Link as a brave hero, or be destroyed by Link so that he can be a hero. Every monster he slays is weaker than him, slower than him, hesitates before him like they're scared of him. All the most dangerous monsters hide from Link behind locked doors, but the key is always nearby, along with a weapon conveniently tailored to that monster's weakness. And most of all, the world itself bends before him. Vast kingdoms are reduced in scale to the point of being effortless to traverse. No gap is so wide that he can't cross it. The most perilous mountains are reduced to short footpaths and simple rock climbing walls, etc., and so on.
One could easily dismiss this as reading sinister intent into basic game design. After all, why have a treasure chest that can't be opened? Why have a monster that can't be defeated? But I could just as easily ask, when the game tells you that Link is wise, powerful, and courageous, why would you believe it? Part of what I find enduringly compelling about Ocarina of Time is how its simple design and its broad archetypal story invites these illuminatingly contradictory interpretations. Games happen just as much inside your brain as they do on a screen. The process of consciously interpreting games, trying to figure out what's being communicated through their writing, through their mechanics, through their design, makes them more fun.
It isn't just that you could see this game's story as being either about a compassionate healer or an entitled reactionary. You can reinterpret the game on a smaller scale. Take the aforementioned Lake Hylia. When I look at Lake Hylia, I can see that it's a carefully constructed diorama, a miniaturized impression of a lake, designed to look scenic at a bunch of different angles. And that's cool. But I can also see that swimming around the whole thing would be a pointless pain in the ass. To me, though, that just means that Lake Hylia will always feel a little bit bigger than the virtual space it occupies.
That process of conscious interpretation turned something that could have annoyed me into something I find uniquely engaging. I am certain that, to a certain critical perspective, what I just said sounds very stupid. Maybe it just seems like I can just enjoy anything if I stare at it for long enough. And maybe you think that just because I can enjoy it doesn't mean that it's well designed. But I would argue that one of the pillars of Ocarina of Time's appeal is its environmental design, and the key skill that it tests is the ability to understand a space.
My ability to appreciate Lake Hylia isn't a thing that would usually be considered a skill, but as I found a greater capacity to appreciate the game like this, parts of the game where I used to get stuck, even after repeated playthroughs, became parts that I could understand intuitively. Ocarina of Time isn't a very difficult game, but it is still a game where you can get stuck. Not stuck because a boss fight is too difficult or because a puzzle has left you stumped, but stuck because you keep running around in circles, not knowing what the path forward is. I would bet money that, if I did a survey asking people what part of Ocarina of Time had them running around in circles, not sure where to go, most people would point to the infamously confusing Water Temple. But instead of talking about that, I want to highlight a later part of the game, where the player sneaks their way through the desert hideout of the Gerudo thieves, the Gerudo Fortress. You encounter this mini dungeon on the way to the Spirit Temple, which is located deeper in the desert. In order for the Gerudo thieves to grant you access to the Spirit Temple, you have to impress them with your own thieving skills by sneaking past them in order to rescue the 4 homosexual construction workers that they've imprisoned. The first time I got to this part of the game, it was worse for me than the Water Temple. I was stuck for hours. Eventually, I gave up and didn't return to the game for at least another year. The fortress lacks anything even resembling a puzzle, but I still found it impossibly confusing to navigate. I could easily point to design flaws that caused this to happen. The biggest one is the lack of visual distinctions. The visual design of this stone fortress is pretty sparse, with simple brick walls and only occasional decorations. There is no easy way to tell where to go when you're on the fortress's exterior. No easy way to tell where you are relative to the exterior when you're in the interior. Nor is there anything that would help you figure out where you have and haven't been. But I want to take a step back and consider it from a different perspective. Is the lack of navigational aids a flaw, or is it simply an element of the challenge? You could make a case for either, but I was able to enjoy this part of the game more when I decided to interpret it as a test of my ability to work through a confusing space methodically. I see the design of Gerudo Fortress as a distant echo of the design of Goron City, in that it's a vertically layered structure navigated through a system of winding tunnels. Unlike the easily understood concentric circles of Goron City, however, Gerudo Fortress has an uneven, elongated shape that doesn't read clearly up close or at a distance. Also, unlike the single contiguous space of Goron City, the interiors and exteriors of Gerudo Fortress are loaded separately, so even though the entrances to the interior are just open doorways, you can't peek inside, and the interiors are bigger than the exterior space would indicate. Both of these traits are typical of areas in Ocarina of Time, and it's hardly a problem in, say, Kokiri Forest, where a house only has one entrance and one exit. But the Gerudo Fortress is much more complex than that, so these breaks with spatial realism are more impactful. You have to be actively mindful of the relationship between the inside and the outside of the fortress and keep track of where you have and haven't been in order to complete the objective. It's the only part of the game that asks you to navigate like this, weaving in and out of 2 complexly interlocking spaces. It helps then that the challenges inside and outside the fortress are simple combat and stealth scenarios and don't involve any puzzles. The stealth aspect is particularly important, even if it is annoying needing to hookshot out of the jail cell every time you get caught by a guard. This punishment isn't just a waste of time, though. By resetting the player's progress through the area, it also gives them an opportunity to start making a new mental map, in case their old one wasn't working. It encourages the player to proceed deliberately, instead of simply brute forcing their way through every entrance and exit repeatedly, until they find the one that they have forgotten. The problem then, as it is with most of these hedges against brute force tactics, is that if you do try to use brute force tactics anyway, it will be even more annoying. And that does suck, because if you're at the point where you want to use those tactics, you are probably already pretty annoyed anyway. Frustration in games is a feedback loop. The more frustrated you are, the worse you play. And the worse you play, the more the game will punish you. But if you can avoid getting sucked into the vortex of the frustration feedback loop, I found that there is a satisfaction to be had in skillfully navigating Gerudo Fortress. It's a satisfaction tied to the technical limitations of the original version of Ocarina of Time. Weighing in at 32 megabytes, Ocarina of Time was of typical size for a Nintendo 64 game, which is to say, its cartridge held about 5% as much data as the CD-ROMs used by the original PlayStation could. This left limited room for unique assets, the kinds of unique assets that might aid your sense of direction. In a way, the Gerudo Fortress harkens back to the dungeon crawls of older role-playing games, which tasked players with navigating labyrinths that were all but completely bereft of detail. Video game technology has progressed to the point where it's now much more possible to fill an entire world with unique features. Is it better to make understanding a space easier like this? Is it bad design to make it difficult to understand a space through absence of detail? It's alienating, sure, but I think it's an approach to designing a space that has a unique appeal. It's just one of many ways to test spatial reasoning skills. Of course, maybe it helps that the rest of Ocarina of Time isn't designed in a sparse, alienating way like Gerudo Fortress? Or does that make it worse because the player is unprepared for this type of challenge this late in the game? Is it really a new type of challenge? You could say that it's fundamentally asking the player to do the same thing that all the major dungeons do. Slow down, pay attention, keep track of where you've been, and try to understand what the space is actually asking you to do. And, like all the rest of the game's dungeons, you can finish it very quickly if you have a fundamental understanding of the environment that you're in.
That notion of a player understanding the environment that they're in is an ephemeral one, but it is the key to understanding what makes Ocarina of Time compelling. That holds true for every part of Ocarina of Time, from the playground of Kokiri Forest to the maddening depths of the Water Temple to the highest room of Ganon's castle.
To that end, I want to go back to the lands of the Zoras and the Gorons, or more accurately, I want to go back to the paths leading to Zora's domain and Goron City. Both of these paths use their environmental design to communicate story. I'll start with Zora's River. Ocarina of Time is a game full of cool zones, and Zora's River is one of the coolest. In a similar way to Kokiri Forest, Zora's River appeals to me on a basic instinctual level. This game has been lodged in my psyche for so long that I'm tempted to just leave it at that.
But I embarked on the journey of writing this whole goddamned thing because I wanted to articulate reasons to appreciate Ocarina of Time in terms of its craft and artistry. I want to do more than just show off different views of Kokiri Forest or Zora's River and say, this is pleasant, this is cool, I like this. To that end, I already described in depth how Kokiri Forest is constructed. It's a comfortable, open playground.
Zora's River is more of a linear obstacle course, not so much a super difficult Ninja Warrior type obstacle course as much as the inflatable kind that I just learned you can get for a surprisingly cheap price on Amazon, but an obstacle course nonetheless. In other words, it's a slight step up from the playground of Kokiri Forest in terms of challenge and stakes. To get to the source of the river, Link has to keep his footing on a twisting, zigzagging path that runs alongside the rushing waters. Making this slightly more challenging are
Octoroks
and
Tektites.
they behave the same way they did in Lake Hylia. Tektites skim across the river's surface, jumping at you if you get close. Octoroks hide invisibly underwater, bursting out to take pot shots as you run by. And run by you likely will, as both of these enemies are easy to avoid. But if you slip and fall into the river, the current sweeps you along on a defenseless walk of shame right through all the monsters you didn't deal with on the way up.
This is already a pretty solid little set piece. But there's an additional wrinkle that I find particularly interesting. It involves an underrated mechanic that throughout the entire Legend of Zelda series is only present in Ocarina of Time: hidden rupees.
So, for example, you're awarded a few green rupees for swimming in the moat right outside Hyrule Castle. You're awarded a blue rupee when you hop on the hopping platforms outside the Kokiri shop in just the right way. And you are awarded a red rupee when you stand on the right part of the construction site in Kakariko Village. They are little rewards for exploration. At least they are most of the time. In Zora's River, they take on a slightly different role. Invisible rupees are hidden throughout the river itself. Perhaps it's to give a consolation prize to players who stumble and fall in, or maybe they're there to tempt the player who got swept up in the current. Don't try to pull yourself up, keep floating down and get more rupees. But if they had forgotten to deal with the Octoroks and Tektites on the way up, it becomes a joke played at the player's expense, as the sound of rocks breaking across Link's skull intermingles with the chime of a rupee being picked up. The mechanics and the environmental design combine to create a set piece that could tell a handful of different stories. Maybe it ends up being a story of a daring, confident hero, able to glide through with ease. Or maybe it becomes the story of a tenacious little boy who keeps pulling himself up every time he falls down. Or maybe it ends up being the story of a victim of hilarious slapstick pratfalls. Maybe it ends up being somewhere along that spectrum. Of course, this storytelling is greatly assisted by the audiovisual drama of Zora's River. The terrain is lively, with its walkable path twisting, zigzagging, and splitting to dramatically showcase its cliffs and its rock bridges. Zora's River is made up entirely of some of the best views you will find in Ocarina of Time. These views are carefully framed by the high rock walls on either side, which expand and contract to create the sense of an ever-changing landscape. The scenic views are accompanied by the sound of rushing, bubbling water, the sound of a cuckoo off in the distance, the crack of an Octorok's rock shattering nearby. The dramatic scenery, along with the narrow winding path, the sounds of rushing water, the way the light changes as the sun rises and sets, and the dynamic soundtrack carried over from Hyrule Field, all comes together to create a sense of forward momentum that makes running through this area feel great. It is good, then, that this area isn't simply used as a corridor, but has secrets and activities in its own right. There are 4 pieces of heart, 4 gold skulltulas, and 3 grottos packed in here. Of all of these, 2 of each can be accessed as soon as you can properly enter the area, but getting access to them may require some creativity with one of the silliest and most fun parts of Ocarina of Time. If you hold a cuckoo above your head and jump off a cliff, you can use it to glide, or you can come back to deal with it later. Zora's River doesn't want to waste your time for no good reason. Plant a magic bean, and once Link is an adult, he finds a magic floating plant that grants easy access to most of the area's secrets, along with a scenic overhead view. Zora's River is a zone with surprising depth and complexity accompanying its strong audiovisual design. Far simpler in its ideas, and in the execution of those ideas, is Death Mountain Trail, which the player ascends to reach Goron City, Dodongo's Cavern, and Death Mountain Crater. To put it simply, because simply is probably the only way you can put it, Death Mountain Trail conveys the perilous sensation of going up. It does this in the bluntest way possible. You run up a sloping path, and you get to Dodongo's Cavern. Run up another slope that overlooks the previous slope, and you've arrived at Goron City. Climb up some steps, then run a little bit further, then climb up a rock wall to reach the red-hot Death Mountain Crater. The walk from one end of Death Mountain Trail to the other takes longer than the walk from one end of Zora's River to the other, especially if you stop to shield your defenseless head from falling rocks. Accompanying that increase in travel time, however, is a slight but noticeable decrease in density and complexity. There are 4 gold skulltulas here, yes, just as in Zora's River, and 2 grottos, which is a respectable amount of grottos. But there's only 1 piece of heart, which only becomes accessible after Link becomes an adult. Granted, there are technically more enemies, 4 Tektites right at the beginning, and then 3 Skullwaltulas on the rock wall at the end, but their placement renders the former a non-threat and the latter merely a nuisance, and the overall process of moving through this zone is much more straightforward, literally, in that so much of it consists of running in a straight line. In fact, initially, before the player gets the bomb bag, all they can do is run in 3 consecutive straight lines, encountering almost no danger over the course of about 45 seconds in order to reach Goron City.
Despite what my tone may indicate, though, I think Death Mountain Trail is a perfectly fine little zone. Partly, this is because its simplicity is juxtaposed against the comparatively complex, dense environment of Goron City. More importantly, though, I think its simplicity helps communicate its central idea of upward motion.
The player starts at the base, with the rock walls rising up high on either side, threatening to swallow them whole. As they climb higher, they catch glimpses of the sky, before it's again swallowed up by the rock walls. As they approach the summit, the sky turns red and they have to hunker down to protect against the flaming hot rocks spewing out of the active caldera of the volcano. Then they have to slowly inch their way up a rock climbing wall, carefully picking off spiders as necessary. Finally, they arrive at the summit, blue skies stretching out all around them. The simplicity of the navigation, combined with those little bits of resistance that force the player to slow down, well serves Death Mountain Trail's singular purpose. Now, keep the layout of Death Mountain Trail in your head for a little bit. It will be important in a moment, but first I have to take a detour. Ocarina of Time was in development for a long time. At least, it was long for a game released in the 90s. And over the course of the 4-ish years it was in development, it went through numerous changes. A wealth of information about earlier stages in Ocarina of Time's development has been uncovered by digital historians. Of particular note, for my purposes, are earlier versions of some of the game's most famous locations, as well as locations that were cut entirely, which devoted fans and programmers have painstakingly pieced together into a playable form. These maps come from indeterminate periods of time, likely reaching back from November of 1997, a year before the game's release, to the earliest stages in its development around 1994. We can see an earlier version of Death Mountain Trail, and it is almost identical to the way it appears in the final release. It's hard to draw conclusions from the incomplete information we have, but I think it's likely that Death Mountain Trail didn't need to be extensively refined or iterated on, because it's expressing such a simple idea. The designs of more complex outdoor areas, such as Hyrule Field or Zora's River, likely took more time to figure out, and designing a dungeon would be an order of magnitude more involved than that. So far, I've only discussed one of Ocarina of Time's 8 main dungeons. The first dungeon, inside the Deku Tree. This dungeon gives a great example of what iteration and refinement looks like. An earlier version of this dungeon has been uncovered, and it bears only loose resemblance to the version in the final release. This earlier version was likely the one exhibited in a playable demo at a Nintendo trade show, a trade show with the excellent name of Space World, in late 1997. I mentioned that these earlier versions of parts of the game have been recreated. The recreation is based off of this 1997 Space World demo. It's not perfect, but it is a very useful tool for experiencing these earlier stages of the game's development as a game, as opposed to just seeing what they looked like. So, for example, it shows that an additional year of development made a world of difference for the dungeon inside the Deku Tree. For one thing, the progression has been turned inside out, whereas the final version of the dungeon sees the player circling the outer wall and then moving in towards the center, the Space World 1997 version sees the player circling a central spire and working their way outward. Really though, the critical difference is that the earlier version of this dungeon is way too long and quite tedious. We can't know for sure how accurate of an impression that this recreation gives us, but I feel confident in saying that it's a good thing that they extensively reworked it. The first parts of a game need to make a strong impression on players. This statement makes intuitive sense, and the man generally credited with creating the Legend of Zelda series, as well as one of the lead designers of Ocarina of Time, Shigeru Miyamoto, would likely agree. In a 1989 interview, Shigeru Miyamoto said that one of his rules of game design is to design the first level after everything else in the game has been finished. So, the dungeon inside the Deku Tree, as it appears in the final game, is the work of a development team that had become skilled, comfortable, and confident in their ability to design a three-dimensional space. There is a second part to that idea of waiting until the very end to design the first level. Shigeru Miyamoto continued on to say that he designs the second level first. There are conflicting reports about which of Ocarina of Time's dungeons was designed first. The two strongest candidates are the second and fourth dungeons, Dodongo's Cavern and the Forest Temple, respectively.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. This costume fucking sucks, but I'm very proud of it. I painted the pauldrons in this, whatever it is, myself.